Ethan Cole, a decorated Army veteran, was peacefully sleeping in his remote Montana cabin when the smell of smoke tore him from his dreams. As flames devoured the structure, his loyal German shepherd, Ranger, shoved him through a window to safety, but never followed him out of the inferno. 2 years passed, marked by grief, long hospital stays, and broken memories. On the final day, before a struggling local animal shelter closed its doors for good, Ethan, volunteering as part of his quiet effort to reconnect with the world, locked eyes with a severely depressed German shepherd in the farthest cage. The dog's sudden, visceral reaction to his scent made Ethan's blood run cold. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Silver Hollow, Montana, was the kind of small town that winter clung to for 8 months out of the year. Tucked beneath a horizon of snow-laden peaks, its population of just under 3,000 had endured wave after wave of economic decline as logging mills and mining outfits slowly vanished. What remained was a tightly wound community where folks didn't just know your name, they knew your story, your mistakes, and the exact brand of coffee you bought on Tuesdays. Ethan Cole had come back to his hometown 3 years earlier after receiving an honorable discharge, hoping the quiet would help him heal. At 35, the former Army K-9 handler bore more than physical wounds from his deployments in Afghanistan. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the panic that came from nowhere, they made normal life in bustling cities impossible. His therapist had called it PTSD. Ethan just called it life. Tall, broad-shouldered, but slightly stooped now, Ethan's once crisp, squared-off military look had softened. His dark hair, longer than regulation, often fell into eyes that had stared too long at things no one should see. Locals had learned to approach him slowly, and never from behind. What they didn't know was how much darker things had been before Ranger came into his life. The German shepherd had been a rescue himself, dismissed from police training for being too gentle. From the moment Ethan brought the 8-month-old pup home, something had clicked. Ranger could sense the bad nights before they started, often waking Ethan before the dreams grew claws. On the worst days, the dog would lean his solid frame against Ethan's leg, anchoring him when old memories rose like floodwaters. Lena Hartman had been the one who introduced them. As director of the Silver Hollow Animal Shelter, Lena had an uncanny knack for knowing which animals belonged with which people, especially the broken ones. At 29, her strawberry blonde hair was almost always tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. Her soft voice and warm eyes masked a backbone of steel that had kept the shelter running against all odds. She was one of the only people Ethan truly trusted. Colton Reed, however, represented the worst of what Ethan had come to associate with red tape and indifferent institutions. As the shelter board's treasurer, the 45-year-old businessman treated animals like inventory, numbers in a spreadsheet, not lives worth saving. He called it being practical. Ethan had his own words for Colton's brand of practical, none of them printable. Sheriff Adam Blake and Dr. Emily Vargas rounded out the small circle of people Ethan allowed into his cautiously rebuilt world. Before the fire, Ethan had been healing. Ranger had been the bridge between his isolated world and the first fragile steps toward reconnecting with humanity. And then, in one night of fire and chaos, everything changed. Ethan still dreamed of the blaze almost every night. It always started the same way, peaceful sleep shattered by Ranger's urgent, panicked barking. The night of December 18, 2020, had been bitterly cold, with the temperature plummeting well below zero. The old cabin's wood stove had been working overtime. Whether the fire started from a stray ember or faulty wiring, the fire marshal never determined. The result, however, was the same. "Ethan, wake up!" He remembered Sheriff Blake's voice cutting through the noise as firefighters scrambled to contain the inferno. "Where's Ranger?" Ethan had tried to shove past the sheriff, his lungs already raw from the smoke he'd inhaled. "He was right behind me. He pushed me out. He was right there." The memory broke apart after that. A doctor later explained that the mix of smoke inhalation, a concussion from his fall through the window, and the sheer emotional shock had interfered with how his memories were formed. Ethan remembered being physically restrained as firefighters declared the cabin too unstable to enter. He remembered the crack of collapsing timber and the violent roar as the roof gave way. He didn't remember losing consciousness, though they assured him he had. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of hospital lights and sympathetic faces. The burns on his arms and back required skin grafts. His lungs had to be treated carefully, given time to recover, but none of it compared to the gnawing, hollow ache in his chest, the one that grew deeper with every hour Ranger remained missing. "We didn't find any remains," Fire Chief Harlan had told him gently 3 days after the fire. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. The temperature of that blaze was intense, but Ethan had clung to hope like a lifeline. The moment he was released, still wrapped in gauze and against the advice of every doctor, he organized search parties. Neighbors, old friends, even kind strangers, touched by the story, combed the snow-covered woods surrounding the cabin's blackened skeleton, calling Ranger's name until their voices cracked. "He's microchipped," Ethan told anyone who would listen. "He has tags. Someone's going to find him." He plastered flyers in every store, gas station, and diner in Silver Hollow and every nearby town. He called every animal shelter and veterinary clinic within a 100-mile radius. He offered a reward he couldn't afford, and still nothing. Each day without Ranger, each night of silence where barking should have been, turned his fragmented memories into torture. Dr. Emily Vargas had warned him that traumatic brain injuries could create memory gaps. But knowing that didn't lessen the agony of forgetting. Some days, Ethan could clearly remember training drills with Ranger, the crisp commands, the proud tilt of his head, the happy thump of his tail against the floor. Other days, he struggled to remember what Ranger's fur felt like beneath his fingers. The brain protects itself, Dr. Vargas had explained during one of their quiet weekly sessions. Sometimes memories are buried, not lost. They may return when you're ready. Weeks bled into months. The weather grew crueler, and search efforts faded. The Montana wilderness, blanketed in deep snow and brutal wind, made continued searching risky. Sympathy in the town shifted gradually. Compassion cooling into quiet pity. People stopped saying Ranger's name around Ethan. 6 months after the fire, Sheriff Blake sat Ethan down at the town diner, ordering 2 coffees before he spoke. "Ethan, I'm saying this as a friend. You have to consider the possibility that Ranger isn't coming back." Ethan stared into the dark liquid, the steam rising like ghosts of memories he couldn't let go of. "I can't stop looking," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not saying stop hoping," the sheriff replied, the lines around his eyes softening. "But maybe it's time to start healing too." That conversation marked a quiet turning point. Ethan began the slow process of rebuilding, both his life and the ashes of what he'd lost. With insurance money and the help of a few fellow veterans, he started constructing a new, smaller cabin on the same stretch of land where the old one had stood. He took on more carpentry jobs around Silver Hollow, discovering that the rhythm of labor, the weight of wood, the precision of nails and measurements helped quiet the storm in his head. And on Haley's suggestion, he started volunteering at the Silver Hollow Animal Refuge. At first, it was just a few hours a week, doing basic repairs the underfunded shelter couldn't afford. But gradually, it became more regular. There was something grounding in the routine, something healing in the silent understanding of animals who didn't ask for anything more than kindness. "You've got a gift with the hard cases," Haley said one day, after Ethan coaxed a terrified beagle into eating from his hand for the first time in days. "They see something in you," Ethan shrugged, brushing it off, but deep down he knew what the animals sensed. They saw the same fracture lines he saw in them, wounded souls, recognizing each other in the silence. Still, every time a German shepherd came through the doors or popped up in a lost and found listing, Ethan's breath would catch in his throat. He'd chased down more than a few leads, once even driving through a blizzard to a neighboring county, only to find a Malinois mix with nothing in common with Ranger beyond a pair of brown eyes. Each false hope left a deeper scar. As the second anniversary of the fire approached, Ethan found himself reluctantly embracing the one thing he'd resisted the most: acceptance. Ranger was gone, and if he couldn't bring his dog home, the best tribute he could offer was to save others. He stopped, actively searching. but his eyes still scanned the roadside when he drove. His ears still perked at the sound of barking. Hope hadn't vanished. It had just become a quieter companion, a dull ache instead of a burning flame. Until today. The Silver Hollow Animal Refuge had been fading slowly for years under the weight of budget cuts and community neglect. The once lively converted warehouse at the edge of town now wore peeling paint and rusted chain-link runs like battle scars. When Ethan arrived for his usual Wednesday shift, the air inside was heavier than normal. "It's official," Haley said, skipping any small talk. Her usual brightness was gone, replaced by exhaustion and dread. She handed him a letter sealed with the county emblem. 30 days, that's all we have left. Ethan read the letter, the bureaucratic phrasing hitting like a slow-motion gut punch. Funding discontinued, property reassigned, operations dissolved. The final paragraph was the worst, detailing the mandatory transfer of remaining animals to the county-run facility 60 miles away, a high-kill shelter. "There's gotta be something we can do," Ethan said, handing the letter back. Haley tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small gesture Ethan recognized by now. It was her tell. She did it when bracing herself for something hard. "Collins called an emergency board meeting tonight," she said. "I'm going to propose a last-ditch fundraising campaign, but..." Her voice trailed off, the weight of reality finishing the sentence for her. "I'll be there," Ethan said without hesitation. He had always avoided shelter politics, preferring to wield a hammer over a vote. But this was different. This was war. Haley's smile was tired, but it still held its warmth. "Clean up in Kennel 3. First new intake came in yesterday. No one's been able to get close to him." Ethan gave a nod and grabbed a pair of gloves and a mop bucket from the utility closet. He knew the layout of the shelter like the back of his hand by now. The intake room branched off to the right, the cat quarters to the left, and the main kennel corridor stretched straight ahead. 20 individual runs, each its own little world of waiting. Kennel 3 was halfway down on the left, typically reserved for larger, more high-strung dogs. The snarling started before Ethan even reached the gate. Low, guttural growls rolled out of the shadows, punctuated by sharp, warning barks that bounced off the cold concrete walls. "Easy," Ethan murmured gently, keeping his movements slow and his gaze averted. He'd learned the language of fear long ago. This wasn't true aggression, it was survival, trauma wrapped in teeth. A German shepherd was curled into the farthest corner of the run. Ribs stood out under a filthy, matted coat. The fur was dull, weather-beaten. The dog's lips curled back over yellowed teeth, but it didn't lunge. It didn't retreat either. It just watched. And those eyes, God, those eyes, haunted, hollow, like it had seen too much, like it had lost something it couldn't name. Ethan moved with practiced ease, changing the water bowl, clearing the untouched food, scrubbing the edges of the kennel. The shepherd didn't blink, didn't flinch, just trembled. A slow, quivering tension locked into every muscle. "No appetite today, huh?" Ethan murmured as he worked. "That's okay. Take your time. No one's going to rush you." He finished the cleanup and backed out slowly, relatching the gate with care. Haley was waiting just outside, arms crossed, watching him with a quiet mix of concern and admiration. "That's the closest anyone's gotten," she said softly. "He was found out near Ridgecrest Pass a couple weeks ago. Hikers said he kept circling their camp, wouldn't come near. Animal control had to trap him." "Any ID?" She shook her head. "No tags, no chip. Dr. Patel says he's about 4 years old. No major injuries, but he's badly underweight and..." She hesitated. "He's got old lung damage. Scarring? She thinks it might be from smoke inhalation." Ethan's eyes locked onto the shepherd again, scanning him with renewed focus. Black and tan coat, broad shoulders, the classic saddle pattern. The size was right, though it was hard to be sure through the grime and starvation. But Ranger had a white mark on his chest and one paw. He looked down, too much dirt to tell. His throat tightened. "Has he responded to any names?" Ethan asked, barely managing to keep his voice even. Haley met his gaze. Her expression softened, sympathetic, knowing exactly what he was really asking. "We've tried everything," she said gently. "Ethan, I'm sorry." Later that evening, the shelter's cramped meeting room was packed wall to wall. Volunteers leaning against old cabinets, board members squeezed into mismatched folding chairs. The air buzzed with quiet tension. Colin Mathers stood at the head of the scratched oak table, spreadsheets in hand, the collar of his crisp shirt barely hiding his discomfort in a room full of people dressed for work, not politics. "The numbers don't lie," he said, tapping the documents. "We've been running at a deficit for over a year. The county's made it clear, no more emergency grants. We've exhausted every formal channel." "We haven't exhausted the community," Haley shot back, raising a stack of stapled pages she'd thrown together over lunch break. "I'm proposing a 30-day emergency fundraising campaign. Founders' Day is coming up. 3 weeks. We could run a booth, organize a major adoption push, add donation incentives." Colin let out a low chuckle, more scoff than humour. "Still the eternal optimist, Haley, but let's be real. This place has been bleeding money for years. Even if you manage a miracle and raise enough for one more month, what then?" Ethan leaned forward, arms resting on the edge of the scarred table, his voice calm but razor-edged. "Maybe the problem isn't the shelter. Maybe it's how it's being run." The room fell silent, like a snapped wire. Colin's eyes narrowed. "You're out of line, Walker. You're not even on the board." "No," Ethan said evenly, meeting his gaze. "I'm not. I'm just someone who shows up, who's seen what this place means to the people who still believe in it, and these animals. They don't deserve a death sentence because of poor leadership." The room erupted. Tension crackled as board members argued across one another, some defending Colin, others backing Haley. Voices layered over each other, heated words with no direction. In the end, nothing was truly decided. The countdown remained. 30 days until the shelter's doors would close for good. Haley was granted permission to run her fundraising campaign, but the skeptical glances and reluctant nods around the room made the truth clear. No one expected her to succeed. That night, back at his property, Ethan stood alone under a moonless sky, shovel in hand. The wind bit through his jacket, but he hardly noticed. The fire debris still scarred the land like a wound that refused to heal. Twisted metal, cracked concrete, and layers of ash where memories once lived. He hadn't been able to bring himself to clear it all, not until now. He dug for hours, the cold numbing his hands, his breath rising in pale clouds. His shovel hit something solid with a dull clang. Curious, he dropped to his knees and brushed away the soot and frozen dirt. Slowly, a blackened object came into view. A metal food bowl, scorched but intact, Shadow's bowl, unmistakable in its shape and wear, with the faint remnants of the name once etched along the side. Ethan sat back on his heels, the bowl cradled in his hands. A surge of memories hit like a tidal wave. Shadow as a floppy-eared pup, pushing the bowl across the kitchen floor like a toy. Shadow patiently waiting for the signal to eat, eyes locked on Ethan's. Shadow nudging the empty bowl forward after dinner, just in case there might be more. The tears came before he could stop them, hot, silent, and unstoppable. He didn't sob, he just sat there, tears streaking down his soot-smudged face, the metal bowl cold against his palms. That night, for the first time in nearly 2 years, Ethan dreamed of Shadow. Not the fire, not the panic, but of open fields and golden light, of the two of them running side by side, free and whole, the way it used to be. He woke with a jolt, heart pounding. The clock read 3:17 a.m., the exact minute the fire had started. Miles away, in a dimly lit shelter, the German shepherd in Kennel 3 stirred. For days he had barely moved, barely eaten, existing only in the shadow of instinct and memory. But now, something had shifted. The dog stood slowly, ears twitching, body tense. He lifted his head to the ceiling and let out a long, low howl that echoed through the silent shelter. It wasn't a cry of fear. It was a call. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the shelter before sunrise, well before the others. He parked his truck behind the main building, still cloaked in shadows, and sat for a moment in the driver's seat. His hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving. Then he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a towel-wrapped bundle. Inside was the food bowl. He held it for a long second before tucking it back inside and locking the glove box. He wasn't ready to talk about it, not yet. Not even with Haley, but something was happening, something he couldn't explain. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid to hope. Haley was already at the shelter, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion, but still sharp with purpose. "I'm making flyers," she said, not looking up from her laptop. Her voice was hoarse from a night without sleep. "Emergency adoption event next weekend. If we can get even half the animals placed before the shutdown. That's fewer heading to the county facility." Ethan shrugged off his jacket and hung it on the peg by the door. "Want help?" Haley gave a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything, but for now start with morning feeding. Angela's out sick." The rhythm of the morning chores grounded him. Kennel by kennel, Ethan moved with quiet efficiency, filling bowls, replacing water, offering soft words and gentle scratches where welcome. Each cage was its own little world of need and survival. When he reached Kennel 3, he hesitated. The German Shepherd was awake, more alert than before, no longer collapsed in the corner like a shadow. His body was still tense, but not trembling. His eyes followed Ethan with focused intensity. The low growl that rumbled from the dog's throat was automatic, not threatening, a reflex. Ethan crouched low, keeping his voice steady and calm. "Brought you breakfast," he said, sliding the food bowl forward. "No pressure, just here if you're hungry." The dog didn't move right away, but then a sniff. Faint, cautious, deliberate. Something stirred in Ethan's chest. Recognition, not a certainty, but a flicker, like a breeze fanning an ember. He forced himself to look away. He'd made that mistake before. Hope had teeth when it bit down. Later that afternoon, as Ethan was cleaning the outdoor runs, Haley met him at the gate. "There was a call while you were out back," she said, brushing her hair from her face. "Someone spotted a stray near the old Carson place. Might be that collie mix from last week." Ethan grabbed his coat. "I'll go." "Take my car," she said, tossing him her keys. "Your truck sounds like it's dying." Then, as he turned to leave, she added, "The fundraising team's meeting at the diner tonight, 6 o'clock. I could really use a familiar face." Ethan nodded. "I'll be there." A new thread. The Carson property was a dead end. No paw prints, no dog, just brittle leaves and rusted wire fences bowing in the wind. But something kept gnawing at Ethan's gut. Not the stray, but something else. The kind of itch that only quiet curiosity could scratch. Instead of heading home, he made a detour. The public library still smelled like dust and lemon polish. Ethan hadn't been there in years, but Mrs. Hancock, the town librarian, greeted him like no time had passed at all. She didn't ask why he needed the microfiche machine. She just smiled kindly and led him to it. Ethan scrolled through local newspaper archives, eyes scanning headlines from December 2020 through February 2021. He was searching for... He didn't quite know what. Something, anything that might fill in the lost time after the fire. Just as he was about to give up, a headline from January 18th, 2021 caught his eye. Local ranchers report unexplained livestock deaths. Long while, he wasn't afraid to hope. The article detailed a string of cattle killings near Whitaker Pass, the same area where the German Shepherd had been found 2 weeks ago. The injuries were unusual, wounds to the throat deep but clean, not consistent with coyote or mountain lion attacks. One rancher claimed to have glimpsed a large, dog-like animal moving silently through the snow. Ethan's breath caught. Whitaker Pass. Weeks after the fire, could Shadow have survived and hunted to stay alive? He printed the article, hands trembling. He stayed for another hour, combing through related stories until he had a small folder of clippings, scattered puzzle pieces that didn't quite form a full picture. Yet, on impulse, Ethan turned to Mrs. Hancock as he packed up. "You know where I'd find public records for the shelter board?" he asked. "County clerk's office," she replied without hesitation. 2 blocks down, open till 5. At the county clerk's office, Ethan asked for the most recent filings tied to the Pine Ridge Animal Shelter. What he found stopped him cold. Derek Thompson, the man who had dismissed Haley's plea with smug certainty, had only joined the shelter board 6 months ago. Before that, he'd used his position at the local bank to vote against multiple funding extensions for the shelter. And now he was listed as a member of a planning committee pushing a proposal for commercial redevelopment on the very land where the shelter currently stood. Ethan stared at the printed documents, heart pounding. This wasn't just mismanagement, this was a setup. Back at the diner, the back corner of the diner buzzed with subdued energy. The fundraising committee had taken over 2 tables, a patchwork of familiar faces, local shop owners, volunteers, and Dr. Miller in his ever-present flannel. Coffee mugs steamed between stacks of notes and menus. The scent of fries and fading hope hung in the air. Mason stepped inside, his mind still racing. The puzzle pieces were beginning to align, and he was certain now everything pointed back to Kennel 3. Haley looked up from a hand-drawn poster and blinked, surprised to see him. "I didn't think meetings like this were your style," she said, voice light but edged with exhaustion. Mason slid into the empty seat beside her. "Neither did I," he admitted. "Guess I'm full of surprises." He didn't mention the microfiche articles or Derek's real estate ties. Not yet. Without something concrete, it would sound like a conspiracy theory born from desperation, and the truth deserved more than half-formed hunches. The meeting was equal parts hopeful and heartbreaking. Ideas flowed: a silent auction, a dog wash, a Founders' Day adoption event. A local cafe owner offered to donate a week's profits. Another agreed to host collection jars. There was laughter, even a few genuine smiles. But underneath it all was an unspoken truth. Even if everything worked, it might only buy them a few weeks, not a future. During a quiet lull, Mason spoke up. "What about a permanent solution? Something more than a band-aid? Could the shelter become a non-profit? Get out from under the county?" That got their attention. Haley exchanged a look with Dr. Miller before answering. "It's possible," she said slowly, "but it's not simple. We'd need a new board, new bylaws, tax exemption paperwork, fundraising infrastructure." Dr. Miller nodded. "And a different location. The county owns this building." "But it could work," Mason pressed. "With time." "Yes," Haley said, "but we don't have time. Not the kind this would need. At least 6 months of legal prep, maybe more." Mason's voice was quiet but resolute. "We have 30 days. After the meeting broke up, Mason lingered. One by one, the volunteers drifted out into the cool night until it was just him and Haley sitting beneath the hum of the neon sign. He waited until the last waitress turned her back before he leaned in. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about Derek." A brow furrowed. "What about him?" Mason laid it out carefully. The archived articles, Derek's late addition to the shelter board, the committee plans for a new development, right where the shelter stood now. Haley stared at him, lips slightly parted. "You think he's tanking the shelter on purpose, just to get the land?" "I think," Mason said, "that his sudden interest in animal welfare has more to do with profit than compassion." Haley stirred her untouched coffee, gears turning behind her tired eyes. "Even if you're right," she said softly, "we still have the same deadline. 30 days. "No," Mason said. "But if the community finds out they're being manipulated, if this is a land grab dressed up as a budget crisis, that could change things fast." Later that night, back at his half-rebuilt cabin, Mason couldn't sleep. The wind outside scraped dry leaves across the porch, but inside it was the German shepherd's face that haunted him. The posture, the eyes, the almost familiar way he moved. Could it be? Mason slipped out of bed and padded across the floor in bare feet. He opened an old trunk, pulling out water-warped boxes from the fire's wreckage. In the bottom of one, wrapped in a scorched towel, he found it. Shadow's old tug toy, made from thick, fire hose material, smoke-damaged but whole. The second he held it, a flood of memories surged through him, Shadow racing across the training field, his jaws locking onto the toy with fierce determination, tail wagging like a metronome of joy. Mason didn't cry. He just stood there a long time, holding it like something sacred. The next morning, he was waiting at the shelter gates when Haley arrived, keys jangling as she approached. "I need to try something," Mason said, voice low but firm. He nodded toward Kennel 3. Haley looked hesitant. Concern flashed in her eyes. "Mason, I know what you're thinking." He didn't let her finish. "I'm not trying to convince anyone, I just need to know." She studied him for a beat, then slowly nodded. "Go ahead, I'll make sure you're not interrupted." This time, Mason didn't approach the kennel like a handler. He didn't angle his body or avoid eye contact. He didn't pretend calm. He walked directly to the gate and sat on the cold, concrete floor, cross-legged, with the toy in his lap. The German shepherd was already watching him, tense, ears back, teeth just slightly bared. Mason spoke softly, almost reverently. "I need to know if it's you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the toy, set it gently on the ground, waited. The shepherd's growl died in his throat. His eyes locked onto the toy, unblinking. A long, stretched silence filled the space between them. Then the faintest shift, A paw lifted, nostrils flared. Mason's breath caught in his chest. Recognition? Mason didn't wave the toy, didn't toss it or coax. He simply held it low, just close enough for the shepherd to see and smell. "I need to know if you're my shadow," he said softly, voice tight with hope and fear. The shepherd's nostrils flared. The tension in the kennel shifted from defensive growl to charged stillness. Mason's heart pounded like a drum in his chest. He waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15, nothing. The dog didn't move, didn't blink, just stayed crouched in his corner, golden eyes locked on Mason's. But Mason didn't leave. He didn't flinch, then the faintest flicker, not a wag, just a twitch of the tail, barely perceptible, but it was something. Mason's breath caught. "Remember this?" he whispered, gently squeezing the toy. It let out a faint, familiar squeak. The shepherd's ears pricked, a reflex, small but immediate. Mason told himself not to read into it, that it wasn't recognition, couldn't be, but the shepherd shifted, not toward him, but not away either. His body softened, shoulders dropping, tension fading just a degree. Small changes, they might mean nothing, or they might mean everything. The long week, the next 7 days, blurred into a pattern of obsession. Mason put his carpentry work on hold. Every spare hour was spent at the shelter, chasing 2 impossible goals. Save the shelter. Prove the dog in Kennel 3 was Shadow. Both missions felt like desperate stabs in the dark. Fundraising gained traction. Volunteers posted online campaigns. Businesses stepped up. And the adoption event neared, but it still wasn't enough for long-term survival. And the shepherd? He gave Mason just enough to fuel the fire. Some mornings he responded to old commands, ears tilting at familiar cues like Platz or stay. Other days he wouldn't even look at him. Withdrawn, shut down. Trauma did strange things. Mason knew that, still it gnawed at him. "You're torturing yourself," Haley said one night, finding him on the cold concrete outside Kennel, 3 long after closing. She crouched beside him, her voice tender. "Even if it is Shadow, he's not the same. None of us are after something like that." "I know," Mason said, staring straight ahead, "but I already lost him once. I can't." "Not again," Haley hesitated. "The county transport comes in 12 days. If you want to adopt him, you need to file the papers soon." Adopt. The word felt too soft, too domestic. How do you adopt a memory? A ghost? "I just need more time," Mason said quietly. Unwelcome guests. The next morning brought answers, just not the kind Mason wanted. He pulled into the shelter lot to see Derek Thompson strolling across the gravel, flanked by 2 men in pressed suits and polished shoes. They were surveying the grounds, pointing at structural corners and taking notes. Derek's expression tightened when he saw Mason. "Here on official business?" he said, voice dripping with false civility. "I volunteer here," Mason replied, calm but firm. "What's your business today?" "Preliminary assessment, county inventory," Derek said vaguely. "Nothing volunteers need to worry about." But Mason did worry, a lot. After they left, he found Haley in the back office, wiping away silent tears. "They were measuring," she said, her voice cracking. "Measuring, Mason. Not for repairs, for demolition." He didn't even pretend otherwise. Mason clenched his jaw, cold fury rising in his chest. "I need to show you something." The smoking gun. From the glove box of his truck, Mason pulled out a thick folder, documents he'd been quietly compiling over the past week. He spread them across the office desk. Property records showing that Derek's wife owned the land adjacent to the shelter. Planning committee minutes where Derek had advocated to repurpose underutilized county assets. And most damning of all, a preliminary site plan from 6 months ago, a retail shopping complex drawn neatly over where the shelter now stood. Haley flipped through them, her hands trembling. "He's been angling for this all along," she whispered. "The budget crisis. He let it happen, steered it even. Conflict of interest at best," Mason said grimly. "Fraud at worst, if he's been cooking the books or blocking funds." She looked up at him, eyes full of fire now. "So what do we do?" Midnight search. That night, under flickering office lights, they met with Dr. Miller and Sheriff Callahan. The sheriff read through the evidence, frowning deeply. "It's damning," he said. "But not enough. You need financials, paper trails, something black and white." Haley nodded slowly. If he's been holding back grants or manipulating funds, it'll show up in the shelter's records. Mason said nothing, just held out a ring of keys the director's master said Haley had given him weeks ago just in case. Together they unlocked the shelter's back office and started searching. Drawers, cabinets, emails, notes, and then pay dirt. A handwritten ledger in Derek's writing detailing which grants to delay and where to reroute funds. Emails urging county officials to deprioritize the shelter due to declining community interest. And finally, a draft contract from Valley View developers offering Derek a consulting fee upon property acquisition. It wasn't just betrayal, it was proof. The next morning, Sheriff Callahan stood in the shelter's office, the folder clutched in his hands. "This is enough," he said simply. "I'll be taking this to the district attorney today." Haley let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Mason looked past the sheriff toward Kennel 3, where the shepherd still waited in silence. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time in weeks it felt like something was finally breaking loose. Hope, a bridge between worlds. The legal wheels were turning slowly, but the countdown continued. Each day ticking down with an unforgiving rhythm. 10 days left. The teams split their focus across multiple fronts. Sheriff Callahan launched a formal investigation, pressing the DA for urgency. Haley shifted into overdrive, accelerating the fundraiser, drafting non-profit paperwork, and rallying community support. And Mason, day after day, returned to Kennel 3, waiting, watching, hoping. Then came a breakthrough from a completely unexpected place, a therapist's insight. That afternoon, Mason looked up from his spot in Kennel 3 to see a familiar figure approaching. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, his therapist, strode across the gravel lot with purpose. "You've been telling me about this dog for weeks," she said, pulling him aside. "I've been thinking, not just about him, about you." Mason frowned. "What do you mean? You've told me how your own memories return," she said gently, "after the fire, during your recovery. What brings them back?" Mason hesitated. "Smells sometimes, certain sounds, places I haven't been in years." Sarah nodded. "Trauma changes how the brain encodes memory, but sensory triggers, scent, sound, touch, they can act like a bridge. If this is Shadow, maybe what he needs isn't commands or toys. Maybe he needs a way back to himself." The idea landed in Mason like a spark catching dry kindling. He'd been so focused on proving Shadow's identity with commands, structure, logic. But what if the answer wasn't proof? What if it was connection? Ashes of the past. That evening, Mason drove north, past the winding back roads, past the tree line, until he reached what was left of his old cabin. The structure had long since collapsed, but the stone foundation remained, moss creeping through the cracks, silent and still beneath a blanket of pine needles. He found the place where Shadow's bed had once been, nestled near the base of the old wood stove. The ground there held the ghost of something familiar: ash, earth, charred wood, and memory. Mason crouched low, scooping a small bag of soil into an old handkerchief. He tied it tight, then sat back, letting the silence settle around him. "Let this work," he thought, "please." Recognition. The next morning, Mason entered Kennel 3 as he always did, slow, quiet, low to the ground. But this time, he brought something different. He unrolled a clean towel on the floor and sprinkled a small amount of the soil across it. To Mason, it smelled faintly of smoke and damp leaves. To a dog, it might smell like home. Shadow's head snapped up. His nostrils flared, wide and urgent. He sniffed once, twice, and then surged to his feet. For the first time, he left the corner on his own. Mason froze. The shepherd crept forward, paw by paw, drawn by the scent. He reached the towel and sniffed deeply, his whole body trembling as his nose brushed the earth. Then he looked up, not at the toy, not past Mason, at him. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, Mason felt the world tilt. A gravity shift, like something broken finding its original shape. "Shadow?" he breathed, his voice cracking. "Is it really you?" The shepherd stepped forward and gently, carefully, nudged Mason's hand with his nose. Mason's breath caught. It was the same gesture Shadow had always used, not begging, not demanding, just asking to be touched, asking to be known. Mason reached out with trembling fingers and laid his hand on the dog's head. Shadow didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He leaned in, the tremor running through him mirrored in Mason's own chest.
"I found you," Mason whispered, eyes flooding. "I finally found you, boy." For a long time, they stayed like that. Shadow pressed against his knee. Mason curled protectively around him. No words, no movement, just quiet, stunned reunion, the weight of survival. Shadow's body told its own story. He was thin, too thin, every rib visible beneath patchy fur. His once strong frame had faded into bony angles and weathered scars. Mason's fingers found old wounds, some healed, some knotted with rough tissue, a survivor's roadmap. "You've been through hell," he murmured, "but you made it back." Shadow pushed harder into his hand. Haley appeared 30 minutes later, stopping cold at the sight. She didn't speak at first, just stood at the entrance, eyes wide. "Is it really him?" she whispered. Mason nodded, unable to say anything past a lump in his throat. The odds of this moment were absurd. That Shadow had escaped the fire, survived the wilderness, landed at this shelter, in this town, with days to spare. But here he was, the first steps home. "We need to get him checked out," Haley said softly. "Dr. Miller should see him right away." Shadow refused to let Mason out of his sight, but the leash triggered a panic, tail between legs, teeth bared in fear. Instead, Mason took off his flannel overshirt and gently wrapped around Shadow's neck, knotting it like a scarf. A familiar scent, a familiar weight. Shadow accepted it. The walk to Mason's truck was slow, unsteady. Shadow clung to Mason's leg, body quaking with each unfamiliar sound. Tires crunching gravel, a distant dog barking, even the wind rustling the trees. "It's okay," Mason whispered again and again, his hand never leaving Shadow's side. "I've got you now. You're safe." The damage, Benny. At the clinic, Dr. Miller worked quickly and quietly. X-rays, blood work, careful hands. The results were grim, but not hopeless. Severe malnutrition, Dr. Miller confirmed. Multiple old fractures, 3 ribs, his front leg, and signs of prolonged exposure. And he paused, tapping a scan of Shadow's chest. Smoke damage to the lungs. It's likely permanent. Mason held Shadow's paw, refusing to let go. Will he get better? Dr. Miller glanced at Shadow, now curled protectively beside Mason on the exam table. Physically, with time, food, and care, yes, the lungs will need monitoring, but he's stable. Emotionally, he exhaled. That's harder. He's bonded to you. That's a strong sign. But you may never get back the dog you lost. This one's been changed. As if to prove the point, a technician entered the room, and Shadow flinched violently, a low growl rising in his throat. Mason calmed him with a touch, and the growl faded. He remembers what it means to be afraid, Dr. Miller said gently, but he also remembers what it means to be safe. That's where you start. He handed Mason a stack of supplies, medication, recovery food, a follow-up appointment. Take him home. The drive back to Mason's cabin was tense and difficult. Shadow refused to settle in the passenger seat or the back. Instead, he crouched low on the floor by Mason's feet, shifting nervously with every turn, making the journey precarious. When they finally arrived, Mason gently lifted the exhausted dog inside and laid him down on a makeshift bed near the wood stove, the very spot where Shadow's old bed had been before. That first night was restless. Shadow slept fitfully, waking with soft whimpers that tore at Mason's heart. Each time, Mason slid down from his own bed to the floor beside him, murmuring soothing words until Shadow finally settled again. By dawn, Mason had given up on his bed entirely, curling up on the floor with one hand resting lightly on Shadow's ribs, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breathing. Morning brought new challenges. Shadow wouldn't eat from his bowl, only accepting food when Mason fed him by hand, and even then cautiously, as if unsure whether to trust. The sound of running water sent him scrambling under the bed, trembling until Mason coaxed him out with gentle patience and treats. Outside was worse. Shadow refused to step beyond the porch, his body stiff with terror at the open space. When Mason tried to encourage him, Shadow flattened himself to the ground, a posture Mason immediately recognized from his work with severely traumatized military dogs overseas. "Okay, no pressure," Mason said quietly, sitting beside him. "We'll take it one step at a time." He called Abby to explain he wouldn't be at the shelter that day and settled in for the long, slow process ahead. For the next 3 days, their world shrank to the small cabin and its immediate surroundings. Every small victory, a full meal eaten from a bowl, a night without waking, stepping just 3 feet off the porch, was celebrated like a triumph. At Shadow's follow-up, Dr. Miller noted some physical improvement, but remained concerned about the dog's mental state. "I've treated abused and traumatized animals for 30 years, he told Mason privately, while a vet tech distracted Shadow with treats. "His bond with you is extraordinary, but it's intense, and that can be a problem. He shows significant anxiety if you're out of sight, even briefly. He's scared I'll disappear again," Mason said, the painful truth settling in. "Just like I was scared he was gone forever." Dr. Miller nodded. "Exactly. You're both dealing with attachment trauma. That makes you the right person to help him heal, because you understand what he's been through. But you need to be mindful of your own emotions. Dogs pick up on that more than we realize. Mason felt the weight of those words. In focusing on Shadow's healing, he neglected his own wounds. That night, he called Dr. Sarah Mitchell and arranged to restart therapy, this time including Shadow. Healing together makes sense, Sarah agreed. Shadow needs to see you working through your own trauma. Later, Mason stood before a crowd at a community meeting. Unadoptable, he said, voice steady though his chest tightened. That's what they called him. Too broken, too scared. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't look at anyone. But the volunteers, those incredible people, spent hours with him, quietly, patiently, just being there. They didn't give up. That's what this shelter does every day. It saves the ones everyone else gave up on. The room fell silent, not from disinterest, but because every word carried weight. Faces turned to Mason, listening. And now, Mason continued, voice rising, we're being told this shelter doesn't matter, that it's just a line item to cut, a piece of land to redevelop, that the animals inside and the people who care for them are disposable. A ripple of quiet outrage spread through the crowd. Mason rested his hand on Shadow's head. The dog sat calm but alert, eyes scanning the room. Look at Shadow, Mason said. 2 weeks ago, he was labeled unadoptable, days from being sent to a place where animals are euthanized when their time runs out. Today, he's learning to trust again. He's healing because someone believed he was worth saving. Abby stepped forward, her voice firm. We found evidence the shelter's financial crisis wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated, a manufactured collapse to clear the way for private development, benefiting a few at the expense of this community. Murmurs turned to gasps as Sheriff Callahan confirmed an investigation was underway. No names, but the implication was clear. Criminal charges were likely. Then the gymnasium burst, not with chaos, but with resolve. People stood, pledged donations, volunteered time and skills. A local vet offered a month of free care. A lawyer promised pro bono help. By the meeting's end, the shelter had enough emergency funding for 3 months, and a committee formed to create a nonprofit to protect it long term. As the crowd dispersed, Mason and Shadow were stopped repeatedly. Stories of rescue poured in. Some simply knelt to meet Shadow's gaze, awed by his quiet strength. An elderly woman approached slowly, eyes wide, never breaking contact with Shadow. I know this dog, she said softly. Last winter, he showed up on my back porch, half frozen, starving. Wouldn't come inside, no matter how I begged. But his eyes, they were the gentlest thing. I fed him for 3 weeks. Then one day, he was gone. Mason's throat tightened. Thank you, he whispered. You helped him survive. The woman looked at Shadow, then back at Mason with absolute certainty. He was looking for you. Animals remember. They know. On the drive home, Mason couldn't shake her words. Could Shadow really have been searching all this time? Some primal bond guiding him through storms and wilderness, leading him here? Back at the cabin, something shifted. Shadow's posture softened. His tail gave a tentative wag. When Mason opened the door, Shadow didn't hesitate. He jumped down and walked straight to the front steps. That's right, Mason murmured. Following, this is home for both of us. That night, for the first time in years, Shadow didn't sleep on the floor. He climbed onto the foot of Mason's bed and curled up beside him. As Mason drifted off, he felt the dog inch closer, resting his head near Mason's shoulder, just like before the fire. In that moment, Mason felt something he hadn't in 2 years. Whole, but peace was fragile. 3 days later, Mason woke to frantic barking. Shadow stood rigid at the bedroom door, hackles raised, his warning bark, so rare now, was laced with fear. A sharp knock sounded at the door. Mason threw on jeans and a sweatshirt, his fingers gently stroking Shadow's head to calm him before opening the door. Sheriff Callahan stood there, his face grave in the dim morning light. Sorry to wake you, the sheriff said, but we got a problem. Inside, Shadow retreated to the far corner, eyes wary and watchful. Derek Thompson's attorney called the DA last night, Callahan explained. They're challenging our investigation, claiming procedural flaws, and demanding the shelter be closed immediately. Mason's stomach nodded. Can they do that? Callahan sighed deeply, running a hand through his thinning hair. It's complicated. We have solid evidence, but it's mostly circumstantial. Without concrete proof of financial misconduct, they're framing this as a business dispute. He pulled off his hat and met Mason's eyes. There's an emergency county commission meeting this afternoon. They'll vote on the shelter's fate. The news hit Mason like a punch to the chest. Just days ago, they thought the shelter and Shadow's future was secure. What can we do? Mason asked, glancing at Shadow, who remained frozen in the corner. Be there, Callahan said firmly. Bring Shadow. Let them see what's really at stake. After the sheriff left, Mason sank onto the couch, mind racing. Shadow patted quietly over and rested his chin on Mason's knee, asking in his own silent way, "What now?" "We're not giving up," Mason whispered, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "Not on the shelter. Not on you." At the commission meeting, Derek Thompson's voice was sharp, frustration flaring. "My business dealings aren't relevant here," he insisted. "I disagree," a commissioner shot back. "Any appearance of self-interest in public resource matters is is absolutely relevant. From there, the debate spiraled. Derek's legal team defensive and aggressive. The commissioners growing resolute. The crowd shifting from neutral to visibly angry. Mason barely registered the words around him. He was crouched beside Shadow, focused entirely on helping the dog breathe. The oxygen helped, but Shadow still trembled. Fear etched deep in his eyes, every breath a battle. "We need to get him back to the clinic," Dr. Miller murmured, checking Shadow's pale gums. "This environment's too stressful. He needs more intensive care than we can provide here." Mason's heart clenched. He didn't want to leave the meeting before the decision, but Shadow's health came first. Abby touched his shoulder gently. "Go. I'll call as soon as there's news." The next hours blurred in the antiseptic haze of the clinic. Fluorescent lights harsh overhead. Shadow was placed in an oxygen chamber. His breathing was so labored that Dr. Miller mentioned the possibility of emergency intubation. Mason refused to leave, sitting vigil by the clear walls of the chamber, hand pressed against the barrier. "Fight," he whispered. "Don't give up, not now." Twilight shadows stretched across the floor when Mason's phone buzzed. Abby's voice was shaky but hopeful. They voted to suspend the closure indefinitely. They're launching a full investigation into Derek and the development deal. Mason should have felt relief, but all he could do was watch shadows slow, strained chest rising and falling. They had saved the shelter, but he might still lose his dog. "He has to make it," Mason choked out. "I can't lose him. Not again. Not like this." Through the longest night of Mason's life, Shadow fought for every breath. Dr. Miller had called in a specialist from Helena, a respiratory expert who arrived before midnight, bringing advanced equipment rarely used on animals. The small clinic's treatment room transformed into a makeshift ICU. His body's exhausting itself trying to breathe, the specialist said, peering through the chamber's port. The infection caused severe inflammation in already damaged lungs. Mason stayed by Shadow's side, ignoring every gentle suggestion to rest. He sat on the cold linoleum floor, hand hovering near the chamber, touching it whenever allowed. The vets worked quietly around him, understanding without words. Separation now might do more harm than good. "Talk to him," Dr. Miller suggested during a rare lull around 3 a.m. "He knows your voice. It might soothe him." So Mason leaned close and spoke in a hoarse whisper, telling stories of their cabin before the fire, the trails they'd hike again, the special bed he'd built just for Shadow. He made quiet promises, peaceful evenings by the fire, no more separations, a forever home. Whenever Shadow's eyes fluttered open, they stayed fixed on Mason's face. The heart monitor reflected the change, a subtle dip, a calm, each time Mason spoke. By dawn, the infection was finally yielding to treatment. Shadow's oxygen level steadied, no longer plunging. "He's got fight in him," the specialist said, reviewing the charts. "He survived 2 years alone after saving me from that fire," Mason replied quietly. "Fighting is what he does." Mid-morning brought a brief break. Dr. Miller stepped away to tend to other patients while the specialist stayed by Shadow's side. Abby arrived with coffee and sandwiches. Mason gratefully accepted. Realizing he hadn't eaten in over a day, she settled beside him on the floor. "The community's asking about him," she said softly. "Word spread after the meeting. People want to help." Mason nodded, too drained to respond. The week had nearly broken him. The shelter crisis, finding Shadow. This fight, Derek's been suspended from the bank. The developers pulled out completely. They say they had no knowledge of his manipulation. Under any other circumstances, that news would have felt like a win. But Mason barely heard it. All that mattered was Shadow. Around noon, the door creaked open quietly. Sheriff Callahan stepped in, hat in hand. Shadow's eyes followed the movement. No fear this time. "I thought you might want this," the sheriff said, offering a small paper bag. Inside was Shadow's old collar, blackened by smoke, but still intact. "Where did you find it?" Mason asked, tracing the worn leather with gentle fingers. "In the evidence locker from the fire investigation. It should have been returned with your belongings. I found it this morning." Mason cracked the oxygen chamber open just enough to slide the collar inside, placing it near Shadow's nose. The response was immediate. Shadow sniffed carefully, then his tail thumped faintly against the chamber floor. "That's the first time he's wagged his tail since yesterday," Mason whispered, voice thick. The sheriff nodded. "Dogs remember. Their sense of smell connects to the oldest part of the brain. It's the strongest memory trigger there is." Through the afternoon, Shadow's condition steadily improved. By evening, he no longer needed the full oxygen chamber. With just a nasal cannula, his oxygen levels held steady. Mason was finally able to reach out and touch him again. "We're cautiously optimistic," Dr. Miller said as Shadow was moved to a padded treatment table. "He's responding better than expected. The next 24 hours will be critical." That night, Mason slept on the floor beside Shadow, his hand resting gently on the dog's paw. For the first time in days, he slept deeply, soothed by the steady rhythm of Shadow's calmer breathing. He woke to a soft nudge, a wet nose brushing his cheek. Shadow had stretched just far enough to touch him, still weak, still tethered to oxygen in 4 lines, but alert and familiar in a way that made Mason's heart swell. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Shadow's tail gave a slightly stronger wag. "You're gonna be okay, aren't you? You're too stubborn to quit." In the days that followed, Shadow grew stronger. His cough lingered, but became more productive. His appetite returned. The spark in his eyes brightened. His ears perked just so, small signs of the dog Mason knew and loved. On the 3rd day, Dr. Miller laid out a long-term care plan. "The damage is permanent," he explained, studying the x-rays. "He'll always be vulnerable to infections and have limited stamina, but with careful management, he can still live a good life." The regimen was demanding: daily medications, breathing treatments, close monitoring, and absolutely no exposure to smoke or dust. Mason took in every detail, determination hardening in his gaze. "When can I take him home?" he asked, eyes never leaving Shadow. "If he keeps improving, tomorrow," Dr. Miller said with a hopeful smile. "But I want to see him twice a week for now." The next morning, as Mason prepared to take Shadow home, Abby arrived at the clinic with unexpected news. "The shelter board met last night," she said, her face a mix of disbelief and excitement. "With Derek gone, they voted unanimously to move forward with the nonprofit transition, and they want to create a special program for rehabilitating traumatized animals." She hesitated, eyes brightening. "They're calling it the Shadow Program." Mason looked down at Shadow, who sat patiently while Dr. Miller removed his four. "What do you think, buddy? Want a program named after you?" Shadow let out a soft woof, his first vocalization since the crisis began. "I'll take that as a yes," Mason chuckled, his voice rough from disuse. "Though I'm not sure how much volunteering will do while you're still healing." Abby shifted, then added carefully, "Actually, the board was hoping you consider a more formal role. They've created a position, rehabilitation specialist, to run the program. It's yours if you want it." The offer caught Mason completely off guard. Carpentry had always been his way to stay busy, to cope, but working with traumatized animals, drawing on the skills he'd honed with military dogs, and now with Shadow, that felt different. It resonated. "I'd need a flexible schedule," he said thoughtfully, "at least while Shadow's recovering." "We can work with that," Abby assured him. "The program won't launch for a few months. Plenty of time for Shadow to regain strength, and for you to design the protocols." Later that morning, driving home, Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat instead of cowering on the floor. It was a small victory, but one that tightened Mason's chest with motion. Shadow wore his old collar, cleaned and restored by Mason's careful hands, a quiet symbol of survival, of connection. Back at the cabin, Shadow stepped out of the truck with a steady gait and curious eyes. He surveyed the familiar property, no longer haunted by fear. Still thin, still cautious not to strain his injured lungs. But something had shifted. His posture carried purpose. Mason watched, struck with wonder. Despite all the dog had endured, the fire, years alone in the wilderness, the fight for his life, Shadow's spirit had endured. Scarred, yes, changed undeniably, but not defeated. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the tree line, a young deer emerged from the forest. It approached the clearing cautiously, ears flicking with alertness. Mason held still, expecting Shadow to react, to bark or chase. But the shepherd simply observed the deer with quiet awareness, showing none of the drive that once would have sent him leaping into the woods. "You learned to live with them, didn't you?" Mason murmured. "Out there you had to adapt." Shadow looked up at him, then back at the deer, his gaze almost contemplative. In that moment, Mason saw it clearly. They were the same. Both had survived fire and loss. Both had wandered wild places. Shadow in the mountains, Mason in the ravaged terrain of grief and PTSD. And both had come out the other side, not unchanged, but whole in a new way, wiser. The deer eventually wandered off, unharmed. Shadow rested his head on Mason's knee with a quiet sigh. Just the faintest wheeze lingering. Overhead, the first stars appeared, silent witnesses to a reunion that defied explanation and yet felt utterly right. Against all odds, they had found their way back to each other. Against all odds, they would heal together 1 year later. Mid-May sunshine bathed Pine Ridge in golden light as Mason stood at the entrance of the newly renovated animal shelter. The old, weathered sign had been replaced with a polished wooden plaque. Shadow's Haven, Community Animal Rehabilitation Center. Beside him, Shadow sat tall and alert, his coat full and glossy though his frame remained lean. A specialized vest marked him as both therapy dog and the shelter's official ambassador. "Ready for the grand opening, buddy?" Mason asked, straightening his tie, a reluctant concession to Abby's insistence that he look the part as program director. Shadow gave a soft woof, eyes fixed on the parking lot where more cars arrived. The shelter's transformation had become a beacon of community pride. After their story went regional, thanks to news outlets and social media, Support poured in from across the state. "There you are," Abby called, jogging over from the training yard. "The mayor just arrived, and the Tribune photographer wants a few shots before the ribbon cutting." Mason smiled at her flustered urgency. Over the past year, Abby had poured herself into the shelter's rebirth. As executive director, Abby had secured grants, rallied volunteers, and managed every detail, construction and programming. The stress had added fine lines around her eyes, but her smile remained radiant, something Mason now treasured more than he ever expected to. "We'll be right there," he promised, squeezing her hand gently. She blushed, and Shadow gave them both a knowing glance. He had witnessed their relationship grow, from collaboration into something deeper, something steady. The ceremony exceeded all expectations. Half the town turned out, joined by reporters from 3 counties and representatives from the state's Animal Welfare Department. Mayor Harris spoke passionately about second chances. Dr. Miller described the new medical protocols developed specifically for traumatized animals. Abby outlined the nonprofit's mission and sustainable vision for the future. Then it was Mason's turn. Standing at the podium, he took a moment to steady himself. A year ago, he had been a man alone, rebuilding a burned cabin and a shattered life. Now, he stood before a community that had become family. "The Shadow program isn't just about rehabilitating traumatized animals," Mason began. "It's about understanding that trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story, for animals or for people." He explained how the program paired rescue dogs with veterans and trauma survivors, offering mutual healing. Already, 3 dogs have been placed with local veterans, transforming lives both human and canine. "What Shadow taught me," Mason continued, glancing down at his loyal companion, "is that healing isn't about becoming who we were. It's about becoming someone new, someone who honors what we've survived." As if on cue, Shadow gave a soft cough, a gentle reminder of the fire's lasting mark. Mason reached down instinctively, his hand finding Shadow's head, soothing them both. "Not everything can be fixed," he told the crowd. "Shadow's lungs will always carry the scars of that fire, but he's adapted. He's found a way to live fully, even with those scars. And that's what this work is about, acknowledging pain but choosing hope." After the ceremony, as guests toured the facility, a reporter from the state newspaper approached Mason. "There's been a lot of interest in your story," she said, clicking on her recorder. "People are calling it miraculous, finding each other after 2 years, Shadow survival, the shelter's transformation. Some say it's fate, divine intervention, even what do you think made it all possible?" Mason paused, watching Shadow several feet away, calmly interacting with a group of children. He moved carefully, conserving energy, but radiated calm and trust. Turning back to the reporter, he said, "I think it was love and persistence, and a second chance." Gently disengaging when the attention became too much, Shadow returned to Mason's side for brief respites, a quiet sentinel beside his human. His calm presence amid the event's chaos was a testament not only to his training, but to something deeper, earned wisdom, forged by time and suffering, tempered by patience. "I don't know if I call it miraculous," Mason added, watching Shadow accept praise from children with quiet dignity. "Shadow survived because he's extraordinary. His training, his intelligence, his will to live. The shelter was saved because good people refuse to accept that money matters more than compassion. And me," he paused, the words catching his throat as he searched for honesty. "I think I survived because Shadow gave me a reason to keep looking forward, even when I thought he was gone." The reporter smiled, eyes gleaming with curiosity. "And your relationship with Ms. Whitaker? The rumor is there might be wedding bells in the future." Mason laughed, easy and unguarded. Across the room, Abby was deep in conversation with potential donors, her expression animated. "No comment on that one," he said with a wink. "But I will say this, Shadow approves, and his vote counts double." As afternoon waned into evening, and the last guest trickled out, Mason, Abby, and Shadow retreated to the shelter's newly finished office. The air inside was cool and quiet, a refuge from the day's excitement. "I'd call today a success," Abby sighed, kicking off her heels and curling into the corner of the office sofa with a tired smile. Shadow immediately joined her, resting his head in her lap as if claiming the space he had long ago earned. "More than a success," Mason agreed, loosening his tie as he dropped into the adjacent chair. "Did you see the donation total? We're fully funded for the expansion and the medical wing." Abby nodded, her fingers absently stroking Shadow's ears, grounding herself in his presence. "I still can't quite believe how far we've come in just a year." They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, wordless, shared. Then, with a subtle shift in posture, Abby looked up. "There's something I've been meaning to ask. Both of you, actually." Her tone held a tremor of seriousness, enough that Shadow lifted his head and looked at her with quiet attention. "That sounds ominous," Mason teased, though a flicker of nervous anticipation stirred inside. "The opposite, I hope." She hesitated, then took a breath. "My lease is up next month, and I was thinking your cabin has that extra room you're just using for storage. The commute to town's shorter. Shadow already has his bed set up there." Mason knelt beside the sofa before Abby could finish. Are you asking to move in with us? Abby nodded, cheeks flushing. It's probably too soon. And I understand if. Shadow interrupted, placing a paw squarely on her knee, his gaze steady and clear, the way Mason had trained him convey his most important messages. I think that's a yes from Shadow, Mason said, smiling as he took her hand. And it's a definite yes from me. Honestly, I've been trying to figure out how to ask you the same thing. Relief and joy swept across Abby's face. She leaned forward, and their kiss was simple, sweet, and utterly sure, witnessed, as always, by the dog nestled between them, who gave a satisfied sigh and settled back into his place. Later that night, with the volunteer dinner concluded and the shelter doors locked behind them, they drove home under a sky awash with stars. The cabin had evolved over the past year, smaller than Mason's original home, but redesigned with care. It now reflected purpose rather than grief. An air filtration system helped Shadow breathe easier. Ramps replaced stairs, so he could reach his favorite lookout spots without strain. Inside, as Mason locked up, Shadow performed his customary perimeter check, patrolling the property with practiced precision. Though the spring night was warm, he returned to his usual place by the wood stove, still his favorite. He seems especially content tonight, Abby said from the doorway, arms wrapped around herself. Do you think he understands what today meant? Mason watched Shadow arrange himself on his bed with slow, thoughtful care. His breathing was steady, though still audible. I think he understands more than we give him credit for. Maybe not the specifics, but the feeling of it. Completion. Purpose. Coming full circle. That night, Mason dreamed of the fire. But this time, the dream was different. There was no terror, no pain, only clarity. He watched his Shadow push him out of the collapsing cabin. And then, something new. Shadow's own escape. His struggle through burning debris. His long, lost journey through forests, abandoned buildings, empty towns. Chased away by fear, hunger, misunderstanding. Always searching. Always returning. Drawn by something unseen but deeply felt. When Mason woke just before dawn, the dream clung to him like morning mist. Beside him, Abby slept peacefully, her hand curled around his arm. At the foot of the bed, Shadow lay wide awake, his eyes watching Mason with an understanding that ran deeper than language. You found your way back, Mason whispered, reaching to stroke the dog's head. Against everything you came home. Shadow rose, stretched, and walked quietly to the bedroom door. He paused, looked back. Mason followed without a word. Outside, the eastern sky was just beginning to glow, the faintest blush of dawn on the mountain peaks. Shadow led him up the gentle slope behind the cabin to a small clearing with a sweeping view of the valley. Pine Ridge nestled in the distance, peaceful and whole. Mason stood beside him in silence, one hand resting lightly on the shepherd's back. He thought of the fire, the years lost, the pain, the waiting, the near giving up, and how through it all they had both kept going, driven not by certainty, but by patience, the kind that bears sorrow quietly, that endures separation, that keeps walking slowly through the unknown, trusting that something awaits at the end. Thank you, Mason whispered into the morning stillness. Shadow didn't respond. He didn't need to. Together, they stood watching the world wake up. And for the first time in a long, long while, Mason didn't feel like he was waiting for anything. He was already home. Shadow stopped at the highest point of the trail, his silhouette sharp against the breaking dawn. He sat with dignified stillness, his posture noble and unbothered by the wind whispering through the trees. The ridge was quiet, hushed with reverence, as if the world itself paused to watch. Mason approached slowly, then settled beside him on a fallen log, content not to speak. He sensed the significance of the moment, not orchestrated by him, but offered, a gift. The sun began to rise, casting golden light over the valley below, brushing the treetops, the rooftops of Pine Ridge, and the distant peaks beyond. Then Shadow lifted his head and released a sound Mason had never heard before. It wasn't a bark, and it wasn't a howl. It was something older, raw, and wild, a voice that didn't belong to the tame life of chew toys and leashes, but to the feral echo of survival, the call of a creature who had lived and nearly died in the solitude of the wilderness. It was a call from the ridge, not for help, but of knowing, of having seen what others had not. A testimony. The sound rolled through the valley, and a shiver passed through Mason, not from fear, but from the weight of something sacred. He felt it in his bones, like hearing a prayer spoken in a language he didn't know, but somehow understood. When Shadow fell silent, he turned toward Mason, eyes steady and knowing. Now you understand. And Mason did. He saw it clearly then, why Shadow had brought him here, to this high place at the edge of dawn. It was a map written not in ink, but in memory. This ridge overlooked the terrain of Shadow's missing years, the forest paths he had hunted, the ravines he had crossed injured, the old barns where he'd sought shelter from snow and rain. This was where Shadow had survived, alone, waiting, searching. It was both an offering and a revelation, a silent story finally told. "Thank you," Mason whispered, his throat thick with emotion, "for not giving up, for finding your way back." Shadow leaned gently against Mason's leg, his solid warmth anchoring them both in the present moment. Together, they watched as the sun crowned the mountains, spilling light across Pine Ridge below. In that valley, the shelter that now bore Shadow's name would open its doors once more, ready to welcome animals in need of another chance, veterans longing for purpose, children learning that healing was possible. And still, man and dog remain on the ridge, side by side, bathed in the gentle glow of morning. No words passed between them, for none were needed. Their silence was complete, rich with the weight of understanding earned through hardship. They had journeyed a long, arduous road marked by pain, uncertainty, an improbable miracle of survival. From this high vantage point, the view stretched wide and clear. They had made it, not simply survived, but transcended. They had moved beyond mere endurance into something far deeper. The path ahead would still be winding and steep, with shadows and unexpected turns, but it would no longer be a desperate struggle just to survive. Instead, it would be a conscious, courageous commitment to truly live, to build something meaningful, lasting, and beautiful from the fragments of all they had endured. In the soft light of dawn, it did not feel like an ending at all. It felt like the start of everything. Narrative close. When we each reach our own ridges in life, those hard-won summits where we can pause and look back across the journey, it becomes clear that the deepest, most profound transformations are born in the crucible of hardship. Mason and Shadow's story is not simply one of survival, but of resurrection, a rising from the ashes, stronger and more whole than before. Shadow, a faithful German shepherd who endured years of loneliness, injury, and rejection, stands as a testament to a truth too often forgotten. What breaks us does not have to define or defeat us. Like Shadow, many of us have faced fires, literal or metaphorical, that threaten to consume us. We have felt losses so vast that recovery seemed impossible. We have known loneliness so deep it seemed eternal. And yet, here we are, still breathing, still moving forward, still climbing. Shadow's journey speaks especially to those who have been forgotten, dismissed, or labeled too broken by a world that often values perfection over persistence. His story whispers softly but insistently, "Keep going. Your past is not your prison. It is your proving ground. The scars and wounds you carry are not signs of failure. They are the maps to your purpose. They are the marks of survival that prepare you for a future shaped by resilience and hope." Every breath Shadow fought for, every step Mason took toward healing, proves that the goal of life is never to return to who we once were. It is to honor who we have become because of what we have survived, to recognize that our pain, our losses, and our struggles have not diminished us, but refined us. Your story still matters. Your purpose still awaits. And like Shadow, one day you may stand on your own ridge, turn your face toward the sun, and finally understand you made it home.